Building in a Small Town, where we're talking to entrepreneurs, community leaders, policymakers, and more to find out how they're building things in small towns. I'm your host, Shelby Smith. Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you for joining me, everyone, and welcome back to the Building in a Small Town podcast. Today, I am super excited. You were on my bucket list of guests, whether you know it or not. I have Bill Menner of the Bill Menner Group and the Iowa Rural Development Council and the USDA, formerly and now again in a contracting position. You are a man of many hats. Bill, thank you for coming.
Thanks. And as an aside, I did not come from a small town. So this whole rural persona is only about 30 years old.
Yeah, well, and I really did want to talk to you about that. I know I mentioned that you are working on a multitude of different projects, and you've been in the rural development and or policy making for quite some time, I think, but you didn't grow up in Iowa, did you?
I did
You're
not.
not an Iowa native, so tell me about that.
I'm an Ohioan.
Okay.
I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland. There was a little bit of agriculture, and we had vineyards there, and maybe one field with beans and winter wheat. But really, it's just a suburb. You don't know you've moved to the next town unless you see you're leaving Avon Lake and moving into Bay Village. So it wasn't until my wife got a job teaching at Grinnell College in 1990 that we picked up and left Ohio, Columbus, Ohio at the time, and came here and didn't think we would stay. We had a newborn when we got here. But we thought, well, this will be good for a couple years, and then she had gone to undergrad up in the Twin Cities, and we thought, we'll go up to McAllister or St. Olaf or Carleton or some other place in a big city. And 33 years later, here we are, almost 34, here we are.
Isn't it funny how that works?
You never can tell.
No, you can't. So then you guys moved to Grinnell because your wife got a job at Grinnell College. So that's what took you there, which Grinnell College, I think, is probably one of the more notable things in the Grinnell area. It tends to be the largest draw for the community.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the largest employer, but certainly it brings an international perspective to the community in lots of different ways, and its endowment certainly generates a lot of attention too.
Yeah.
So 3 of my 4 kids are now Grinnell grads, and it's been a great place to live.
Yeah.
But it's still a town of, I think it's 9,300 now, which I realize in the big scheme of things, comparing the population of Collins to the population of Grinnell is like comparing Grinnell to Des Moines. But when I tell people I live in a small town, they either nod their heads or they roll their eyes.
Yeah, I can see that. It's
not really a small town, is what the eye roll tells me.
Yeah, small towns come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and you're right. With here in Collins, we have 483. Possibly since Willie and I moved here, maybe it's 485 now. But yeah, I definitely come in lots of different shapes and sizes. But so when you were in Ohio, you went to school in Ohio?
Yeah.
Did you go to college in Ohio?
Yep.
Did you study policy making? What did you study?
I was a journalism major. I broadcast journalism. I got a job as a senior at Ohio State at the public radio station as a weekend reporter. And then after I graduated and didn't get a job right away, the public radio station said, well, we need a graduate assistant for weekends. Can you do that? And I said, well, what do I have to do? And they said, you got to go to grad school. And the only program that would take me without having taken the GRE, the graduate exam, was political science. And I already knew some people in the political science department because I'd taken some classes. And so I wound up a poli-sci major, and in my first class wound up sitting next to the woman who would later become my wife. And then after I got my master's in political science, the public radio station hired me to cover first the county courthouse, then county government, and then I covered Columbus City Hall for a few years. And then they handed me an evening, 5-night-a-week, 90-minute sports talk show. So I talked about Ohio State and Cleveland and Cincinnati. And so it was I was a minor celebrity in Columbus, Ohio. I was on the front cover of the Columbus Monthly magazine one month. And then we came to Iowa.
Yeah. And then you had to start all over again.
Start all over.
So then when you got to Iowa, your wife has this new position at Grinnell College. What did you do when you first got here?
I thought I would be Mr. Mom for a while. We had an 8-day-old. And I thought I'll just hang out here. Now, a few radio stations knew that I was in town or in the state. I actually did a couple of high school playoff games for a Marshalltown radio station in that fall of 1990. And the public station in Cedar Falls knew I was here. And then they wound up reaching out to me and said, hey, we've had some departures from our news department. Would you like to come, help us out for a while? And I did, and we turned out we liked each other. And I began 3 years of commuting, 67 miles each way from Grinnell to Cedar Falls and back.
I bet you ran into some snowstorms.
Snow, and that was also about the time of the floods of '93.
Right.
So, there was an entire summer where I was taking very circuitous routes to get there.
Right, because at that point, especially, all of Iowa, but eastern Iowa for sure was ravaged. I do got to imagine there were some major road arteries and things that you would have...
Highway 30 was blocked. 63 was blocked. I had to go all the way over to Highway 21 to get north. It was bizarre, but it was also a long commute. And at some point, the news director said, why don't you start driving to Des Moines every day? Why don't you create a State House bureau for us? So I did.
Awesome.
And I worked out of the basement of the state capitol in the press room and covered the legislature and the governor and caucus politics from 93 to 98 and did that for 5 years and made lots of great friends and contacts and it was a fun, again, minor celebrity kind of experience.
Okay, so that is, would that be kind of what you think catapulted you into more of a political role, more of a government sort of focused role? Was that what set you down that path?
Well, I had been covering City Hall in Columbus, which was just on the road to becoming the biggest city in Ohio. So that was a little bit there from a public policy standpoint. Reporters always think they know more than the people they're covering too. So I had a certain, reporter's confidence that I understood things better than the people who were doing the policy making themselves. And then I was approached by a public policy consulting firm in Des Moines and said, we know you like what you're doing. We also know what wages are for public radio reporters. Why don't you come work for us? And they did and still do really good stuff and have an impact on the lives of folks. The founder referred to it as a benevolent for-profit. So he always took on lots of clients pro bono because they were folks who needed the help.
Right.
So that began a long journey from being a working reporter to delving more deeply into public policy issues and advocacy and community development to an extent.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about the public policy consulting role. Like, I think most people, when they hear that, they either cringe or they go, I have no idea. Like, what is that? Just words to me. What do you do in that kind of a role? What do public policy consulting groups? Are they working with politicians? Are they working with communities? Like you said, like, who are they working with? What did your role look like?
All of the above. Not so much politicians, but certainly interest groups. We had a client that was the National Environmental Trust, which was a DC-based firm that was trying to elevate the impacts of global warming. No one refers to that anymore. It's climate change, but back then it was global warming. And we put together a network of folks in Iowa who were expressing similar concerns. And then we started sharing information with them. They started reaching out to legislators, trying to get legislators to develop policies that might address global warming / climate change. In the 2000 caucuses, this network of folks were all over the state. Every time a candidate had an event, Republican or Democratic, they were wearing buttons that said, "What's your plan?" And they would always raise their hand during Q&As and say, "What's your plan to address global warming?" Mm-hmm. So that's just one example of an advocacy group elevating an issue using a public policy consulting firm. Sometimes it's as simple as, we have things we want to accomplish. We don't know anybody. Can you connect the dots? Sometimes it's a business, and they're saying, hey, we think renewable energy is the future. Can you introduce us, let's say a solar or a wind firm or a company that builds turbines, for example, says, we want to help generate more renewable energy. Connect us, introduce us, share our information with your network, sort of things. I mean, it's as wide as you want it to be.
Sure.
And people always, my kids would always ask me, what exactly do you do? Or their friends would ask them, what does your dad do? And they'd say, he talks a lot.
Yeah, to a lot of different people, it sounds like.
But he talks.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, my consulting business that says advocacy, partnerships, connections, or something like that. And I'm a dot connector.
Right.
And I think a lot of firms are the same thing. I have no specific knowledge of how to do things, but I know people who do. And if you want to in your business take a step in a new direction, I can help you get there, because I don't know the intricacies of that journey, but I know the people at the other end of the journey who are going to help pull us together to where you want to get.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so then during that stint with that particular group, did you have a favorite project that you worked on? Is there one that really sticks out in your mind?
We were working for the phone company that at the time was called US West, and they were had a vision for rural connectivity, and this was before there was fiber to the home. A lot of it was focused on DSL, but it was the internet. And we created a statewide network of individuals who wanted faster speeds. And I'm still shocked at what we were talking about then and what we're talking about now when we think about broadband connectivity and the barriers that exist in a lot of rural communities still.
Yeah.
And how even back then I had no idea how important high speed, and high speed then was nothing compared to what it is now. But we started raising that flag and talking with people about why it's important to have, 14.4 speeds and what that would mean for your community, for your business, for your hospital, for your school.
Right.
It was early in the ICN days, and everyone wanted broader access to the Iowa Communications Network, which was this amazing network of fiber. And now, communities, that are fortunate have fiber to the home.
Right.
And communities that don't have fiber to the home wish they did.
Yeah, of course. So was that your first sort of delve into rural? I know we already talked about Grinnell being, you know, a small town, but not. But so was that your first delve into rural policy? Obviously, you probably ran into that often, you know, running the press box or being part of the press box at the Iowa legislature. But was that your first big, like, project exposure?
I would say yeah.
Okay.
I haven't really thought about that, but it probably is. I mean, I got pulled into stuff, but it wasn't rural specific. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I then moved to the Grinnell economic development role that I played both in downtown development and then countywide, and then got pulled into some statewide projects that it became much more rural specific.
Okay.
But that was sort of, U.S. West project probably was.
The first real exposure to rural. Okay, so then after that policy group, then what?
I worked for the city of Grinnell.
Okay.
I ran a downtown development organization called Grinnell Renaissance, which was focused on about a 4-block radius of downtown Grinnell, and it was a partnership of the city and the college, focused on, you know, the central business district. The chamber had a bigger footprint, but the city and the college thought there was value in downtown and addressing downtown needs. And so they hired me, having never done community development or economic development. But they said, well, we think you can communicate what we want to do and make stuff happen. And the first thing they told me is, we want you to get rid of the one-way streets downtown. The city had this strange little one, square, 4th Avenue, Main Street, 5th Avenue, or 6th, 5th, anyway. There was just this strange loop, and people from out of town would come into Grinnell, take the wrong turn, and be going wrong way down a one-way street, and everyone would be shaking their fists at them or honking their horns. And, of course, those folks would get back on the highway and head out of town.
Right, rather than stop at those businesses.
Horribly dysfunctional, but everybody was liking it, and so I had to develop a framework for changing the minds of the city council and the downtown business owners and why this would be a good thing. And now it's just second nature to everybody. Of course it's two-ways. Why would anyone have? The other interesting thing was, if you were coming from campus downtown and coming down Broad Street by the post office, the first thing you would see is a big red sign that said, "Do not enter." And that was the message that was being sent to all those students at the college, was don't come into our downtown.
Yes.
Now the college is building a dorm on the outskirts of downtown so that students can live downtown and still walk across the street campus.
That's awesome. Yeah, especially because Grinnell, like you said, does pull internationally. It's quite a powerhouse of a little educational, institution. And so I can't imagine that would be terribly welcoming to all of the visitors that come in. Do not enter. If you ever needed a sign, there's your sign. Okay, so and when you stepped into that role, like you said, you had no experience in, city planning, economic development, that kind of stuff. Did the city hand you a plan other than fix the one-way streets, please? But were you essentially, okay, here's the big picture. We need to come up with strategy.
So I had a board, a very good board too, and the first thing was get rid of the one-way streets. Shortly after I started, our 2 downtown pharmacies closed or were bought out by a local grocery store who was opening their own pharmacy and wanted to get rid of the competition. So that took away 2 anchor institutions downtown. And then shortly thereafter, the movie theater closed. And then the marquee on the theater said closed. So we had 2 vacant pharmacies and a closed movie theater. So we went into basically crisis mode. And the first thing was figuring out a way to address the movie theater. Because, man, there's nothing worse on your main street than having the theater with a big closed on the marquee.
Right.
And we wound up, there was a local limited liability corporation that that did some strategic investments. They would buy buildings like this one, fix it up based on the skill sets of their team. They had an architect, they had an accountant, they had a contractor, they had an insurance guy, and they would do a lot of the work themselves, then turn around, fix it up, rehab it, and then resell it, and then take the proceeds from that deal and put it into the next project. Mm-hmm. Well, they pulled their members together and bought the movie theater building and bought a vacant lot next door to it, and then designed a concept for a threeplex. And then we started raising money, and I started raising donations to the city to do the facade work. And, we had Iowa State do an economic impact study that showed that a threeplex instead of a oneplex would have over $1 million a year economic impact on the downtown. So that was, and still is today, 20 years later, a big stinking deal.
Yeah.
To go from a closed oneplex to a threeplex that's driving, downtown development. The city shortly thereafter redid the streets, incorporated a streetscape into things. We had a facade grant program. So many good things have happened, and I'll trace it all back to that decision by that LLC of folks who said, yeah, we can make this happen. We'll buy the building and then the lot next door. And then suddenly things start to happen.
Yeah, the momentum, the ball starts to roll. Mm-hmm. Okay, very cool. So then after City of Grinnell, then what? Well,
the city had been working with Poweshiek County, mm-hmm. And there was a county-wide economic development group that was kind of active. They had a part-time staff, and the city and my board wanted it to be bigger, so we spun off a brand new nonprofit development group. And so I did that. In addition to the downtown development, I was the county economic developer for 4 years, and worked with all the major employers, did traditional economic development work, which I hadn't necessarily been doing in downtown development circles. So that was a good experience, and also brought me into new networks. I was appointed, I got to know it as a reporter. I got to know both Tom Harkin and Tom Vilsack very well. Mm-hmm. Senator Harkin and his role, and Secretary Vilsack was a state senator from Mount Pleasant when I first knew him. So I got to know them pretty well. So Governor Vilsack appointed me to be the first chairman of the Iowa Great Places Board. So I got to go around the state with that board, naming great places, but also seeing really cool projects and visions that communities had, both rural and urban. And meanwhile, I wound up getting pulled onto a board that Iowa State called the Community Vitality Center, which Senator Harkin funded with an earmark to do rural philanthropy and rural entrepreneurship, all sort of coming out of ISU Extension. So I was on their board for a while, and again, talking about rural philanthropy, or in some cases, the transfer of wealth that happens as older rural Iowans pass away and all of their assets go to the heirs who have moved to Chicago or Minneapolis. That loss of wealth in rural communities when estates change hands was something we were talking about, and we were also talking, how do we get small businesses, how do we get people who are entrepreneurially minded to think strategically about, locating in a small town. We know that a small business that comes out of a rural resident in that community is embedded in that place, as opposed to an economic developer who tries to recruit businesses from other places to move from Collins to Maxwell, or to have Baxter trying to poach folks from Colfax, or mm-hmm. It's better to grow them yourself, because they're less likely to depart for greener pastures when someone offers them an incentive or a free building.
Sure. Yeah.
So those were interesting sidebar opportunities that I had in addition to being the county economic developer and the city of Grinnell's downtown developer.
Right. So, and then that's again getting you more into the, like you said, the great places. Those would be some urban areas, some smaller towns. It'd be all over. So it kind of gave you a better backdrop, shall we say, of the variety of different communities and
the innovation that was
Yes.
going on, ideas that, wow, and if you're focused on your job in your town and you're not having the opportunity to network or listen to what other folks are doing or see firsthand how those projects came about, not that you're missing out, but you kind of are.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Without a doubt, that would actually be a really cool position. I'm a little jealous. That sounds like fun to be able to get to go around and see all those things. And yeah, I'm jealous. Anyways, so then after the county economic development, then what was the next step after that?
Well, so through my friends on the Community Vitality Center board, one of whom was a staff person for Senator Harkin, after the 2008 election, she called me and she said, there's a position you'd be really good for. It's the state director of USDA Rural Development. And I said, I don't really know much about it. She said, I do, because I used to have the job in the Clinton years. And she said, and you'd be great. And I said, well, what do you have to do? And she said, you just go around to small towns and give out big checks and kiss babies.
There you go. And so you were
And
like,
I said,
natural.
that sounds great. What do I have to do? And she goes, well, just go to this website, transition.gov, and fill it out. And when it says, what position do you want, say, USDA Rural Development, Iowa State Director. And so I did.
That was the first step.
And several months later, I bumped into a Harkin staffer, a different Harkin staffer, and I said, hey, I put my name into some website. What's going to happen? And the response was, we have bigger fish to fry right now, filling, thousands of positions in the new administration.
Yeah.
We'll get to that eventually. And then I found out that I needed to actually treat it like a campaign. So I got folks to write letters to Senator Harkin saying, hey, Bill Menner would be great for this job. And they did.
Yeah.
And he wound up calling me one day and asked me what I would do if I were the state director. And then I got a call from the White House saying, we'd like you to be the state director for rural development in Iowa.
That's awesome. So is that kind of how that process works then? It's your state senators that ultimately give you the green light or the red light, shall we say? Maybe not officially, but probably.
Well, you're sort of a nominee. Mm-hmm. They nominate you or they recommend you in this case. Right now, there are no Democratic senators or even House members, so the recommendations might come from other sources like Senator Harkin might still weigh in. Secretary Vilsack clearly has some ideas on who might be good, but at the end of the day, it's a White House appointment.
Right, it's a presidential appointee.
You serve at the pleasure of the president. Mm-hmm. Certainly, Secretary Vilsack, knew me, and he probably had veto power if he would have said, I don't think he's
so.
the right person. he would have expressed that, but I spent 8 years on that job, and, we did great things.
Yeah.
The agency invested about $5 billion in small towns, in loans and grants, and whether it's housing, small business, renewable energy, water and wastewater, community facilities like fire stations and hospitals, and you name it. Every element of life in a small town, USDA Rural Development touches in one way or another, or can touch if someone chooses to use the resources.
Right. And so I want to dive into that a little bit more, because I think that in Iowa, USDA, depending on where you are, what you're involved in, a lot of the farmers will deal with USDA FSA.
Correct.
For funding and
or
things
NRCS.
Like that. Yes,
with EQIP
NRCS. Yep. So
conservation.
I think that's pretty familiar for people. I think the USDA Rural Development, I don't think that people understand how large the scope is necessarily, and kind of what things wouldn't be possible, quite frankly, without USDA Rural Development in some of these small towns. Can you speak on that a little bit more?
Well, it's only been called rural development for about 30 years. It used to be the Farmers Home Administration.
Oh.
Before that, it was originally the Rural Electrification Administration. It was REA.
Okay.
And they were the entity that was the byproduct of Congress's decision to create a federal funding platform for rural electrification. Because what they were finding was that the for-profit electric companies were choosing not to invest in rural places, and part of it was that it's expensive to run electric lines down a dirt road when there's only 2 houses at the end of the road.
Right.
So they were making a strategic decision, that it wasn't in their, there was no return on investment there. And Congress said, well, we need to actually electrify rural America, so we're going to, if the private sector won't do it, the government will.
Sure.
And so REA came about, and the government made loans to get providers to extend electric lines to rural areas. Then in 1949, they did the same thing with telephone. Mm-hmm. In the 1980, they did the same thing with broadband. So this idea that there's something special about small towns, special in a lot of different ways, but we're risky. It's a riskier proposition from a business standpoint and from an investment standpoint. And Congress has decided that rural places need some special attention to allow them to play on a level playing field. And by having resources through USDA Rural Development, electric is one, broadband is one, telephone, is kind of one still. But then water, wastewater, energy. The three pots are rural business, rural housing, and then rural communities, rural utilities. So, and business. And it's when I was the economic developer in Poweshiek County, I didn't understand the impact of what the agency could do. I remember Tom Vilsack telling me the same thing when he was governor. He said, I wish I had known when I was governor what I know now as the Secretary of Agriculture about the impact of rural development on small towns. The challenge is, A, you have to know about it. You have to apply to get the funds. B, it's not always easy. If you're the city clerk in a town of 568 and I tell you you're eligible for, grants and loans, and you can get free money to do a new fire station or emergency equipment or housing for upper stories, you might think that sounds great, but I've got to do the work, I've got to do the reporting after the fact. It's a heavy lift, and it is. Mm-hmm. So I think that rural development does have offices all over the state, and I think that the trick is how do we, whether it's the government, whether it's the state empowering rural communities, or it's groups like the Rural Development Council trying to provide some guidance and support and maybe a blueprint for how you make the best use of it without killing your city clerk, who's already got 1,000 other things on her plate right now.
Right, and maybe making it accessible. So you give Grinnell. We'll go back to Grinnell again as the Grinnell example. The city of Grinnell might have the resources and the human resources to be able to allocate to something like that. But again, you come to a little town like this of 483 people that might benefit greatly from these funds, might have a plan in place, might have a group of entrepreneurs that are here and ready, to run with it. But I don't envy the agency's position of trying to figure out a scalable set of objectives, policies, anything that, makes it where it doesn't make it to where somewhere like Grinnell, where they have those resources, can then take all of those resources, but at the same time, you don't make it so many hoops to jump through that a little bitty town that maybe doesn't have those resources can still access it and still utilize it and still build great things, because they can still be built. It's just making it work, I guess.
Part of it is finding those partners that can help that city clerk in that small town, or the elected, the mayor and the council members, or the downtown business members. And say, all right, so, maybe it's a council of government, a COG, or in the case of Story County, the MPO. Maybe it's an existing regional economic development group. Maybe it's leaning on a neighbor who has some structure who can provide some technical assistance in a nearby small town. Or, maybe it's a community foundation. I mean, every town, every county has different assets that it can look to be a partner. And I think that one of the tricky things is helping the folks in that town figure out who their friends are.
Right.
Because their net might be only so wide, whereas we can come in and, oh, have you thought about this?
Right.
Or, you've got a rural telephone cooperative. They have access to 0% 10-year money, that can help fund a project in your town. And they'll show it on their books.
Right.
But that money comes from USDA. So,
yeah, it's just knowing, once again, you're greasing the wheels. You're a wheel greaser.
And for a lot of places, they don't know what they don't know.
Sure.
So, and that's one of the things it's really fun for me to do with the Rural Development Council is for 10 hours a week, as a contract, I get to lead this statewide organization that does just that. Even though the staff is just me, we've got a network of 800 folks who are all interested and curious and eager to connect. And then every year we come together at the Rural Summit, and we have 400 rural leaders in the same room at the same time. And what they're telling is how they did stuff. They're sharing the template for success, or expressing their frustrations with something else, or they're getting together talking about how they can do things better. And there's that strength in numbers is something I always come back to, is that, if you think you can be successful in that town of 568 or 468 all by yourself and not wanting to talk to other communities in your county or in your region or statewide, like Ben Franklin said, we can hang together or we can hang separately. And there's something to be said for hanging together.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we'll get to I do want to get to the Iowa Rural Development Council, because I do want you to expand on that. But during that 8 years running the USDA Rural Development here in Iowa, what are you most proud of? What are you most proud of getting done?
Before I even took the job, I had lunch at the home of that former state director who was working for Harkin, and she said, I want to give you a heads up that there's a little bit of a problem with a rural water system. And they're going to have to raise their monthly minimum rates to some exorbitant fee, and it's going to put water service at risk for thousands of rural Iowans. And it was a water system not far to the west here, Xenia Rural Water. They were $120 million in debt. They had expanded greatly out west on speculative thinking that the western suburbs were going to keep growing. And then the 2008 financial crisis hit, and they were, it was very problematic. And the other challenge was, USDA had a bunch of money in that, but so did some private equity funds. And in fact, they were basically in the same position as far as, who had access to the assets. And in Iowa, a rural water system can't go bankrupt. What they can do is simply cease to operate. And it took almost 4 years, but we figured out a way to restructure the USDA debt to protect the customers of Xenia Rural Water, to work with their board and their operators to figure out ways to do things better, and to work with that private equity, group out of New York City and get everyone happy at the end. And, Xenia is still a going concern today. They have survived. They continue to provide water to 13,000 rural Iowans and saving them. I mean, it wasn't just me. I mean, I had a great team that worked with me, but collectively, we kept the water on.
That's
so
awesome.
that was a big one.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, you came in during 2008 when you had the financial crisis. Man, I bet that made for some interesting first days and some interesting, kind of set you up, like you said, with some projects that maybe you didn't think were.
I had no idea what I was getting into.
Probably better
I
that way.
I also didn't know that I was going to be, basically the CEO of a state with 120 employees, and that I would spend as much time as I did doing HR issues. But at the same time, I mean, what is great about USDA Rural Development is the fact that there's this network of field offices with people serving these rural places, and they're the actual boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Unlike other federal agencies, which might not have a local presence,
right.
USDA does.
Is unique in that respect.
But
yeah.
both from FSA has that, NRCS has that, and Rural Development has that too.
Right. And all separate silos, if you will, having their own directives. Interesting. Okay. So then that takes you up to 2016. Then what was the next step after USDA?
Well, after the election, when I wasn't going to be staying, I liked what I was doing. And if you think strategically about career moves, you want to make a parallel move at the least. And the only sort of parallel move that would have existed for me was to run a statewide organization or be a CEO, and I didn't see any opportunities like that, but I liked what I was doing, so I just decided to create a consultancy that focused on those sorts of things, connecting dots. I had some early clients that had me working with them on doing housing in small towns, and the Rural Development Council, which I had, they've existed since the early 90s, but when I came in 2009, they hadn't met in a few years, and so I reconvened the Rural Development Council, and we started holding quarterly meetings, and it was a chance for the various partners, federal agencies, state agencies, utility partners, educational entities, the regions, others, just to get together and talk about what they were each doing in these rural spaces, which was why the councils were founded in the first place, was to help prevent duplication and help ensure cooperation.
Right.
And so we started meeting in 2009, and in 2017 they said, well, why don't you just keep kind of running us, and we'll pay you, X amount per month to be our contract executive director for 10 hours a week. So 7 years later, I'm still doing that.
Yeah. Okay. So then tell me a little bit more about the Iowa Rural Development Council. You said it's made up of all these different shareholders from a variety of different organizations, it sounds like, has gone through histories of active and not active. Would you say that this is probably the strongest that it's been in a while? Or
Well, I would say yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, once upon a time, it got money. All of the state rural development councils got USDA funding, which helped to bring on full-time staff. And then that money went away in the early 2000s, and a number of the state rural councils sort of went away because they didn't have the funds and the capacity to survive on their own. Iowa's did, but at some point, a part-time executive director took a different job. The board still was there. There was still money in the bank. The 501c3 status was still valid. They just hadn't gotten together. So I think that where we are today, if you think about that 2009, it had been dormant. 2016, we have the first Rural Summit, which was in Jefferson, which was sort of just the board said, let's have an event. We're spinning our wheels by just meeting on a quarterly basis and not taking advantage of the powerhouses that are in that room, from the Iowa Farm Bureau to Iowa State, Iowa, and UNI, to the state of Iowa, and at the time IDED and DMAC was at the table, and the major utility players were at the table, and it was like, well, yeah, we do have some heavy hitters here. Why don't we do more? And since 2016, I think we have seen the council, on the backs of its members and the board, really elevate and do some important stuff. We provide grants for soft costs for rural projects. We're partnering on a concept right now that talks about what are known as the social determinants of health. So things like what are the things in your town that make people healthy? Well, it's probably access. In addition to access to health care, it's housing, it's water, it's the environment, it's a livable wage, social determinants of health. And we're also looking at how communities define wealth, what are called the wealth capitals. So there's clearly financial wealth, but there's also structural wealth, there's environmental wealth. And so we're talking about how the social determinants of health and those wealth capitals can be sort of merged into a strategic plan for how a community addresses those assets or looks to capitalize on those.
Right. Interesting. So that first 2016 event, how many attendees did
300.
you have? 300.
For a one-day event in the snow, a week and a half after the election in Jefferson.
Wow. And what did you have panels? Like what
We did.
what did the event look like?
We had keynote speaker at the beginning. We broke into small. It was one big room, so we couldn't have breakout sessions.
Sure.
But we did have panels after that. We had a lunch speaker. It was really, more than anything, it was everybody getting together in the same room at the same time and talking about what they were doing in their rural place.
That's awesome.
And people, at the next Rural Summit in 2024, we'll ask folks, who was here back in 2016? I bet you we'll have at least 50 people raise their hands.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the frequent flyers.
Right. And so the goal with the event, I got to imagine, is to, like you said, get everybody in the same room, because, that's where ideas can get exchanged and all of that. But overall, do you put it together as like, here's a blueprint? Do you put it together of like celebration of, look what we've done in the last 12 months? Is it a mix of everything? Like, what's the goal with the event?
I think it's to elevate issues and opportunities and strategies. For example, I got a note from an engineering firm and said, hey, we'd like to present at the Rural Summit about some technology we're using. And I said, yeah, that's not how we do things. Now, if you have 3 communities that are using this technology and want to tell their story, that'd be fine. We want these breakout sessions and these best practices or case studies to come from the rural folks themselves, because it's different when somebody from a small town hears another small town tell their story.
Right.
The first thing they think is, we can do that. And then the next thing they think is, well, wait a second. And then they pull that person from that town over and say, how did you do this again? And they wind up, sharing notes and, creating these replicable, frameworks for success, these blueprints. And I think the challenge every summit is to find new topics. Like, for example, one of the things we're going to have a session about rural pharmacies and how some small towns have basically done it themselves. They found an operator or found a telepharmacy network that's willing to invest on-site, technician and keep open a pharmacy. And how important is it to have pharmacies? And how are these towns doing it? State Center comes to mind. They've had one. Brooklyn has done that as well. So we'll have a session like that. We'll have a session on, innovative ag technologies. There's a company up in Nora Springs, way up by the Minnesota border, that just won a $100,000 innovation grant to expand. And I think they have a planting system or a new planter technology that they've developed. There's all sorts of really cool stories also from all over the state. The grocery store in Lenox, that has branched out and has created these lockers where they can bring groceries to somebody in a neighboring small town that doesn't have a grocery. And because there are these refrigerated lockers in that town, they can just deliver it, and the person has the code, and they can pick up their groceries. And they're not in a food desert anymore.
Right.
So, it's fun putting the agenda together every year, but it also requires that you've gone out and heard about some of these things.
Yeah.
When I first heard about you, it was kind of like, no, that can't be right.
Yes. Oh, don't worry. I get that a lot. Yes. Yeah. Very cool. What has been your, I wouldn't say your favorite session. What's been your favorite takeaway or example of collaboration that's come out of the Iowa Rural Development Summit? Is there one that comes off top of mind? That's kind of a hard question going through 7 years of, growing an event.
I think there's a cohort of young women who have emerged as champions for the summit, and each of them is in a different rural place, but they each have visions for how they think the summit can continue and how it can do even better. And so they actually meet as a little group amongst themselves or talk with me about ideas that they have for the summit. Recognizing the fact that it is the one big chance for folks every year. Now, there are other meetings. The economic developers get together, and the chamber executives get together, and there are Main Street communities all get together. But this is the one that's specifically rural focused, and I think the folks in these small towns have an affinity for those opportunities, and so I think that's something that comes to mind. And then I'm always hearing about someone who heard about a project in another town, went home, and we asked communities to come in teams of 3 because we often have 3 breakout sessions going concurrently so they can divide and conquer.
Sure.
But the fun thing is when they get in the car and go home, and they usually ride together, they're talking the whole time, and they're already a subcommittee, to make things happen.
Right.
Rather than have one person from a town come and drive home alone and come home and tell everybody what they learned. Here's 3 people that have been there. Or in the case, some towns send 2 teams or 3 teams. You've got this, again, back to that strength in numbers concept. Mm-hmm. You have folks that want to come back and make something happen based on what they heard or what somebody else has done that they just heard about.
Yeah. So you have obviously got quite a diverse background when it comes to rural development experience in rural communities and all that kind of stuff. You've seen it develop over years. Are there themes that you see of communities that are, shall we say, on the decline or dying? I know every situation is unique, but if you look at it, yeah, obviously depopulation, but something's causing that. Like, is there a lack of something in particular or a group of things that you see that's putting communities on decline?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is something I mentioned earlier with the ability of that city clerk to make things happen, and it's a lack of capacity. Who's going to do the work to make stuff happen? Mm-hmm. But I think the underlying challenge that drives that lack of capacity is a lack of leadership. So the really small towns that are successful have a remarkable core of leaders, or a remarkable leader, singular, who's making things happen and who's pulling other people in. That rural leadership vacuum in some places is the defining difference maker. There are towns of under 1,000 that if you were to ask me to name, remarkable small towns, and I name them, and you say, well, why are they special? And it's because they have folks that have taken it upon themselves and are making things happen. They have a vision, they're collaborative, they engage other folks, they have this holistic vision for their community, and they're moving in a direction. There are other places where folks don't want change. And part of it's because change is hard work. Part of it is that change is scary because you don't know what you're going to get. And some of it is that, for some, they want to go back to the way things used to be, which was more comfortable for them. And I understand that. But when we think about where these rural populations are going, what is it that's going to attract young people, new business, new investment? There's got to be a vision to where folks are going. But the only way to have that vision is to talk about it and develop a plan to get there. And that's work.
Right.
And the places that have leaders, whether they're elected leaders or civic leaders or great volunteers or all of the above, they not only are engaged, but they're working together and doing great things as a community. But there's over 800 small towns in this state, and not one of them is created like the other.
Right, and that is another challenge that I suppose from an agency's perspective, or even with the Rural Development Council, trying to figure out what elements of a blueprint of what worked in a town. Let's just take Collins, for example. We have right now powder coating, where they've grown over the years. They're right up the road. We have Small Town Tattoo, which he's one of one. You won't find him anywhere else, that kind of thing. We have Fisher's Firearms. We have Snack Shack, 24-hour snack place. We have a brand new consignment business going, and we have a hair salon, like all of these things. We have crickets, we have the landscaping, but if you look at collectively, you do have some businesses that, you might find in another small town, like the hair salon and maybe the firearms, but some of us, we're highly unique in what we are, and you're not going to find another cricket lady to go plop into a, 500 person town. So figuring out, the kind of businesses that you can attract, the location agnostic sort of businesses that aren't going to rely on the external population, things like that. I think that's a tough, and talking to other business owners here, like I've interviewed 2 of them so far, and both of them have said the same thing. We can't rely on the local population to survive. And that's just a reality of 483 people. You can't. So figuring out from your perspective as, I won't call you policymaker necessarily at this point, but sort of, policy influencer, figuring out what is the blueprint that we can hand then to the other town of 500 of, look what they did. You're not necessarily going to find the exact same players, but here's things you need to look for, or here's people you need to try and connect to. I think that's a tough nut to crack.
It is. And I think around Story County, and you've got Nevada is knocking the ball out of the park right now. But they're in a different universe.
Yes.
We funded a soft cost grant for a child care concept for Colo, for the school district. And it looked like there was lots of stuff going on there. I mentioned to you off the air that I've been in Baxter recently, And even though that's Jasper County, there's an interest. I think that there are these pockets of innovation and pockets of energy that sometimes it's more a matter of who's driving those little things. If you draw a 20-mile radius around your community, whether it's Collins or whatever, but then start to think, all right, where are their affinities? Who is there in town who's predisposed to be entrepreneurial, and who doesn't think of themselves as an entrepreneur, but in fact they are, whether it's a business entrepreneur or a social entrepreneur. What do people like about the community? What do they wish it could be? And then how do you start to implement those wishes, or at least start to develop a plan to achieve them? And I'm convinced that there is as much good and innovative going on in communities of under 500 as there are in communities between 500 and 5,000.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of, if you've seen one small town, you've seen one small town.
Yeah, all of them are so different, and yeah, interesting.
Okay. Not many towns have a facility like this. There are a number of catalyst projects, and that's the state program that provides $100,000 to fix up dilapidated buildings. It's better than tearing it down, because raising a downtown building is not cost effective and it doesn't make sense. But preserving a building like this with great bones is a big deal. And a lot of small towns, it takes the city to be the applicant, and a lot of cities aren't willing to do that. The fact that this city did that speaks highly for it, which tells me fertile ground.
Yes, we are. I think we are very, very lucky in this community. I think, the person that was our initial catalyst, shall we say, the mayor. The mayor gets a lot of shtick from people within the town of some things that he does and all that kind of stuff. But he really, especially back before we got here, was driving the bus of getting people here and making an effort to get people here. I told the story on my episode, like telling my story. But the reason I'm in Collins is I was looking for a building to put in a processing plant. I went and looked at this building that was for sale, just 50 feet away from us, because I wanted to buy something, because drying crickets is a long process. I can't really rent it. I was location agnostic. Didn't matter. It was going to be a food processing plant. Most of my stuff is online and in wholesale anyways. And so I was one of the organizing members of 1 Million Cups Ames. And so the Ames Chamber was involved, and one of their employees does all the outreach for the Story County community. Right now it's Greg Picklap is the one who is in that position, but at the time it was a different guy, and he had said, there's this space in Collins that you want to go look at it. And so I did. I came and looked at it, and I came and looked at it with my dad, and I said, it's a little far away, like, I don't know, we'll see. Later that week, I was at the Ames Farmers Market. Mayor of Collins stops at my booth. I'd never met him before, but he stops at my booth, hands me a piece of paper with his phone number on it, and says, "We want you in Collins. So, like, whatever we need to do to get you here, like, we want you in Collins." And so I was like, well, I'll go take another look. And, the next month I did end up closing on the building, and then we've kind of been off and running since then. And, he's been a great advocate for the community of getting things done. If you want to come in here and build something, I think Collins is unique in that way of, they might, make you jump through some hoops. They might give you a little pushback initially, but I think there is a core group here that does want to grow and wants to see the community overall elevated. And so then I think we just have gotten a really unique group of entrepreneurs here too that have ended up pushing it forward. We'll see how that continues. We're kind of constrained on commercial space now, so figuring out a plan, for expansion past that, we might have to be calling the Bill Menor Group to come advise us on how we should move forward. But it's exciting for us, I think.
Having Ames Economic Development, though, as a partner is a big deal, and the fact that they do all of Story County and now into Boone County as well. Yeah. Their footprint is big, and they bring capacity
Yes.
and play a role, since you don't have a cog necessarily,
Right.
where they can be that subject matter expert or the connecting dot.
Yes.
Greg's networks are vast. Dan's networks are vast. Brenda, they all know folks. So
Yes.
you can lean on them, and it's great to have them as an asset. A lot of small towns and a lot of counties don't have access to somebody like that.
Right. Yeah. No, like I said, we are particularly lucky with the group that we have access to and are surrounded by and everything. And so I don't know. I never thought of myself as a small town girl and didn't think I'd end up in a small town or anything like this, but I'm pretty proud of what we've built so far, and I'm excited about the opportunities that we have moving forward. So anyways, okay, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Is there do you have advice for anyone considering a small town, whether it be investing in one, starting a business, community that's like, how do I get to this, rural development summit? Like, what do you got?
Well, first, I think in a small town, your ability to make an immediate impact is much greater than if you were to land in a big urban area. If you want to be a difference maker, a change maker, it can happen a lot faster. That's not to say you couldn't go to a neighborhood in a big city and be a neighborhood leader, but in a small town, you can have a disproportionate impact in a quicker amount of time on a significant number of people. I mean, you can come in and make a difference. So I would say that if that's something that interests you, whether it's from a volunteer perspective or owning a business perspective or changing the world perspective, a small town isn't a bad place to start. The Rural Development Council, it really is a platform for folks to learn and connect and to hear about stuff. When I say you don't know what you don't know, I try to reach out to everybody every week and tell them those things that they might not know that they don't know. I shared last year the fact that one of the members of Congress in the state was taking applications for funds of money that members of Congress it's the old earmark that used to exist, and now it's called like a community-directed fund. And they didn't know. Somebody from that district didn't know about it, put in an application, and wound up getting $1 million for a project. And they wouldn't have known about it if they hadn't seen that note that said that this member of Congress was doing that. So the Rural Development Council itself is sort of it's not a pay-to-play organization. It's basically anybody who raises their hand, they're in. You're a member.
Congratulations.
If you want to write us a check, that's even better. But you don't have to write us a check because we think that all of our members, all 800 of them, add value in one way or another.
Awesome.
So our next summit is April 11th and 12th in Ames. We max out at about 375. But it's coming up, and the agenda is falling into place, and I'm excited to have that. It'll be our 8th Rural Summit, which is hard to believe, but I always tell folks it'll be the best one ever.
Yes, of course, managing expectations. Great. So then if people want to keep up with you, if they want to get those weekly updates, what is the best way?
Just IowaRDC.org. Is the website, and there's a chance there to send a question or send a note, and I think somewhere there is my Rural Development Council email address.
Okay.
And I have just, you mentioned at the beginning, I've taken on a new role as a senior advisor at USDA Rural Development. So I'm being contracted with in this role. So I'm going to be doing that for 30 to 35 hours a week, which still leaves me my Rural Development Council time. It's just I've got a few balls in the air now. But the other good thing is that it gives me some proximity to the leadership at USDA Rural Development, the new undersecretary who will be confirmed soon, I hope. And he really is focused on making sure that the field operations, those boots on the ground that I mentioned, are there and effective and have the resources they need to connect with the towns that need them.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, man of many hats. I believe I said that at the beginning, and I still think that's true after this conversation. Great. And so if folks wanted to get that weekly update, do they have to become a member of? No, you just sign up. Okay.
Anyone who sends me a note, I deem them members.
Awesome.
And
Perfect.
They go on the list.
Member by proxy.
Yes.
I like it. Very good. Okay. Is there anything else that you want the people to know?
Thanks for this time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I really did enjoy this conversation, and I think it'll be one of many. So
I hope so.
yeah. Thanks for stopping.
You bet.